Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Pistol, starring Toby Wallace, Anson Boone, Sidney Chandler, Jacob Slater, Tallulah Riley, Macy Williams, and Thomas Brody Sangster, directed by Danny Boyle. First of all, welcome back to Danny Boyle. And what's his take on this material? This is a movie about the Sex Pistols, how much of a band they were, and how much they were assholes, and we'll see if this works for a biopic. I mean, I I know nothing about the Sex Pistols until I watched the show. There's 6 episodes that first appeared on FX, and then it's on now Hulu. So you might be able to watch it on Hulu if you have a Hulu account. So let's get into the show. We open with some old footage from the 1970s as we start with Steve Jones stealing a piece of sound system while an audition man falls asleep, as well as he steals his car with John Lydon as they get pulled over by the cops, and Steve runs away from them by car and hides from them, and as they both escape the cops' custody, which makes me think I'm in for a bumpy ride. Steve, John, as well as their friends Paul Cook and another guy whom I never got his name yet. And that's a problem when I don't know that particular character very well, as I'm going on this adventure with them for the whole series, and I wouldn't have stuck with it if it wasn't for Danny Boyle directing this or any director. I reviewed their body of work, like Mr. Boyle. They start a band and don't know what to call themselves until Steve goes to a store called Sex for whatever reason, as he has an encounter with Vivian Westwood and Malcolm McLaren play. And the actor playing Malcolm, I've reviewed him since the Maze Runner trilogy and have seen him in The Queen's Gambit, which I wish Danny Boyle directed than this show. And this show is showing the greatest hits of the Sex Pistols as a band and their agent, who will later on be Malcolm. And the shots are typical of Danny Boyle for sure, but unfortunately don't work for this show, progressing episode by episode, and I don't even know what the fucking plot is except for the greatest hits of the life of the Sex Pistols. And after the first 10 minutes of the first episode, I am immediately fucking lost, as this is so sentimental and overly wrought. And at the end of the day, it doesn't make me happy to think this is the worst Danny Boyle show since that Leo DiCaprio vehicle, The Beach. Steve asks Malcolm to watch the band rehearse a song as he's going to manage it, which will lead to a shitload of problems with the show, and he asks his friend Christy to sing for the band, but she says no as they sing a different song and have sexual intercourse until boyfriend Nick and by boyfriend I'm talking about her boyfriend Chrissy's, I mean Nick, comes to the shop she works at, which leads to an awkward conversation which makes me think she's fucking cheating on Nick, as they have no chemistry whatsoever. I absolutely fucking hate these goddamn characters as they feel like assholes to one another. At one point, they say fuck off to one another almost too often that it's starting to annoy the living shit out of me. Steve gets arrested by the cops and is sent to prison as he lived under an abusive parentage of his father, which serves the motherfucker right, in my opinion. While he goes to the courthouse and Malcolm shows up to bail his ass out, as I can't follow any of what the fuck is going on, as it is absolutely very horrible and hard to watch in so many levels. And that's all the 6 episodes. They rehearse the band, and Steve either can't sing or is too chicken to sing in front of the audience, as he thinks of his abusive parents, and people laugh at him. And he's embarrassed as someone comes out to calm his ass down, but walks off, and that's very hard to watch, in my opinion. Vivian wears a shirt with her nipples showing, which is something I'm not comfortable with saying in neither case. And Steve waits outside of the sex store, and Christy is with Vivian, which are uncomfortable scenes right off the bat. Steve visits Malcolm's family as Malcolm gives him a guitar and makes somebody else sing for the band. And who do they get to sing? John, as he has a hard time singing at first, but he will eventually later in the show. And John comes off very problematic as a character, and his performance convinces me he can be the biggest asshole in life. I don't know if that's the actual actor, but John comes to the studio to rehearse, and his goons come to Malcolm off screen and almost gets his head taken off. And Steve and the others forgot the practice, I'll say, or the rehearsal. And the next day, Steve apologizes, and that's when John makes up a name for the band, the Sex Pistols. And he agrees like Malcolm and goes to the sex shop to talk with both Christy and Malcolm. And the acting is fine, but the performances are unfortunately terrible. Steve picks up the guitar and rises it up and hurts himself from practicing it. And they go to a club, but he can't join them. And the next day, Steve loses track of time as he's skipped the practice and shows John he has been playing for 4 days. And Malcolm hires Glenn to join the band, and it shows John doesn't like him at all. See what I mean when these characters come off like assholes to one another? As it makes me think I don't like them as a band in general. They practice one of their songs, and it shows John can sing the lyrics as he sounds like he's saying Antichrist when it's really Anti-Kist, or whatever the fuck that means, until the women come in to have a party as Helena Troy, as she's called in the show, flirting with Steve, and he talks with Chrissy, and I did want to give up on it again, but if it wasn't for Danny Boyle directing this, I wouldn't have survived this series. They go for their first club to where they first play, and they're already criticized by other bands, and they get prepared for their time to sing on stage while Steve throws up because he's nervous because of last time, as John gets the idea of getting pissed off and to destroy the world, and as they play, they get cans thrown at them, and this is punk rock and roll at best, and the fight started getting out of control. This is making me way too crazy. An African American woman, or maybe African England woman named Simone, is frightened of a bald man when she climbs on a tree. She gets spat at, and we go back to the Sex Pistols getting shot thrown at them and starting fights and spitting on the audience and all that kinds of bullshit, which is a way to disrespect the world completely. And we see Simone from the beginning of the episode, and a school reporter asks about their music, and Steve comes in and says they're not into music, they're into chaos as they're outside partying. And you guys already know how pissed off I am at the show. Steve and Christy once again have sexual intercourse, and the problem is not only do they not have good chemistry, but they don't know how to hump each other's ass. John gets singing lessons, and Malcolm is there, and this is when John's feeling for Malcolm is hateful and predictable, in my opinion. Simone comes to the sex store, and so does an anchorman from the news at 10 in England, as a girl sells him something, while Vivian talks with Simone as she finds out she stole something from the sex store, and she's insulted, and that scene was way too melodramatic. John acts like a madman as of lately, and people are starting to hate on him, and so is Malcolm and his family, as they make a Nazi print, and their shots, which is completely offensive, shirts. And John is considering getting out of the band, and the editing in that scene felt very choppy, as this entire show is very choppy, as I can't stand it, and that's a real fucking problem. Steve yells at Glenn, and John comes in and plays some angry music as one guy almost leaves the band until they make a great tune, as John comes up with the lyrics, I am an Antichrist, or as they go to a prison from Chelmsford to perform, and they pick I am an Antichrist, and at every other place, I'm completely bored, as this should have been a 3 very long episode, like an hour and a half each, instead of 6 episodes in an hour or less. Steve acts like a pretentious ass, while Christy briefly plays and she reads the paper that says we're on the chaos, and Christy asks Steve, I'll say, to marry her or else she'll leave England, as she doesn't want to leave England, and being married to Nick won't mean anything to her, which is an interesting but strange line said by Chrissy. because at the end of the episode, it won't mean jack shit. Because Simone came up to Steve and have sexual intercourse in the car, and John tells Chrissy and asks Chrissy to marry John, and that's very problematic, as this is already a problematic show, and this feels very dry of an episode. While Chrissy dumps Nick, and I hate how this ends with them together, and she ends the friendship with Steve, as it looked like he doesn't give a fuck to the point he played the music to distract the devastation. And I don't care, and that's my problem, is I don't care for any of this at all, because it's so bad I can't take it anymore. We see the Sex Pistols on the TV as they're loved by teenage girls, which I don't necessarily get, while they're hated by the rest of the world. Like myself, despite I wasn't alive back when this show takes place, and some teenage girls have haircuts like they have, which feels very fucking weird to me. They record an album as they record a hit in an infamous way, and John and Glenn have a brief argument, and we move on to Malcolm and Vivian having a slight disagreement as well as. And this is pretty much a mess of a show that people who aren't the biggest fans of the Sex Pistols will never watch. As I came in to learn about a little about them, as it's overextended and as it's over, I don't care to learn about them anymore. And this episode felt the longest, as it's the longest episode and it drags right off the fucking bat. They perform in a bar and people throw glass, chairs, and fists at them, and they steal a shitload of Cracker Jacks. And they travel from country to country as they're hated all over the world. As one country says, go back to London, which reminds me a hell of a lot of the racist motherfuckers that say they should go back to their countries, while in a different country, which is painful to watch, just painful. They play at a hotel and it is boogie night, while John is wondering where Malcolm is at, and they play over the boogie night music and get thrown out of the hotel as they're playing loudly to the point they're playing bingo, and I can't stand watching any more of this as it's super fucking painful. Steve is pissed. He walks into a rock beach to be alone, but Glenn calms him down when Steve doesn't need it. And I guess this is a nice quiet moment of the show, so as I'll give it one compliment. And that is, they play quiet scenes kind of good, but that's all I can give it as this point. They play from town to town and country to country, while sometimes to go in an unnecessary storyline of a couple of teenage girls as they escape their parents' house to see the Sex Pistols. Malcolm shows the Pistols his office, and they sign the contract as they learn they're getting £40,000, which is dollars in England. If some people out there aren't too familiar with the metric system, and they go on live TV and tell their families to watch, and as they're on the TV, they cuss on live national television, which is super unlike anyone to cuss on live national television. And this is way, way too much, to the point they get booed off stage like they do in the music stage. And the television program gets a shitload of complaints for letting these motherfuckers go on the TV in the first place, as they can't help but cuss their asses off in general. That hell, I can believe they wouldn't go on the TV, as they're obnoxious, or I don't think they should, and that's why I said these characters are very unlikable, as they're just assholes. They're receiving a lot of hate on the streets and get attacked by people as they get it worse than any celebrity. And I can think of well, the two teenage girls get to London, and as Malcolm gets a call that says they're canceled and banned from playing across the country, and Malcolm has a meeting, and the other music that's not the Sex Pistols are very distracting, and the two teenage girls get to the sex store where they follow John, but he walks out all pissed off, and they serve the two girls as they want to change their lives, and I'm bored. And their music isn't really exciting either, much as it's too goddamn negative. After a concert, they earn £25,000, and Malcolm talks with Steve and John's behavior as of lately, and Malcolm thinks the right thing for the band is to get rid of John, and Steve goes outside and meets the two teenage girls as he wants to lay them both until Jordan comes in a taxi cab. And Jordan was on Game of Thrones, which I couldn't survive the first episode because I couldn't get into it. And I have reviewed her in before in the New Mutants, and she has yet something I can enjoy, but so far I'm not a fan of hers. And the two teenage girls get taken back to the sex shop and decided to tell them to go home and live a better life than the Sex Pistols and being punks again. They're unnecessary of a plot point. Steve goes to Chrissy and she tells him to stand up to him, and he can't believe because he stood up for him in the courthouse earlier in the show. And that is a poor piece of dialogue and the worst excuse I've heard in the dialogue. And they hired Sid Vicious as a new Sex Pistol, and the episode ends that as they get rid of Chrissy. And what the fuck kind of a setup for the next episode is that? As it's hard to understand what they're saying too. Jesus Christ. Steve and John debate over who gets lost between John and Malcolm, as John wants to get rid of Malcolm while Steve wants to borrow some makeup, and John won't shut the fuck up about Malcolm. And the next thing you know, the band practices playing music with Sid, while Sid picks a brief fight with Steve as they're beating each other up. And all of this is absolutely unnecessary. And this episode is about Sid and someone he falls in love with named Nancy, who the audience will meet later in the show, as their romance is awful to watch when I get there. Nancy is first seen in a concert they perform as she annoyed the holy shit out of me, and it's not really the actress's fault, it's more of the material she's given. Sid falls in love with Nancy while they get a ride home in a limousine, and everybody else is super annoyed with her like I am as he comes in with her, and she discovers she's a virgin before they have sexual intercourse. And like the other characters, I hate her as well. John wants to keep the title of a song while Malcolm suggests changing it to something else, while Steve and the band go to Steve's own house and they disrespect his stepfather, as I'm checked out of the show and I have one more episode after this to go. I'm almost there. Steve confesses to Christy she's much better off without the Sex Pistols, while she wanted to be in a band. Meanwhile, John is crazy and Malcolm is a nut job. And Sid picks a fight with another singer as he goes to his mother's place to spend time and take heroin with Nancy. And the next day, Nancy visits Steve to ask for more heroin. But eventually, he does give her some, and she kisses Steve. And why the fuck would she do that? Which is unbelievably terrible. Sid is taken to the hospital, while Nancy goes to the sex shop to come visit him, and Chrissy visits him in the hospital. And Chrissy believes heroin is breaking up the band along with Nancy as she leaves the band and to not serve some jail time. And the next scene, Nancy goes to Chrissy's place to crash, and Chrissy calls Steve to put her on a plane to wherever she came from, as she's a horrible house guest as well as a character. And she's too stupid, she doesn't go on the plane. Meanwhile, Sid gets out of the hospital hearing their song is skipped on the radio, which is the right thing to do while Malcolm does change the title of the song. And Nancy comes back to Sid and John confessing Steve put her on the plane, and also says it's more Malcolm's fault than Steve's, as Malcolm gets arrested, which makes no goddamn sense. Malcolm thinks about blowing off the pistols while they burn some wood, and the next thing you know, the Sex Pistols go to America and go to an American named Allison, who makes rules for them, and Sid mocks and walks all over him. Yes, Allison is a him, and Allison beats his ass up twice, and the motherfuckers are asking for trouble, and I hate that about these characters. They perform at American concerts and get booed off and flipped off, and while on tour they go to a drive-in as they're watching the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I found interesting, but not in a satisfying way. And Sid, behind the band's back, starts cutting himself, which brought me close to home. I will not explain why, as I'm ready for all this to be done. Malcolm finally shows up at America, as it's not nice for John to see Malcolm, and Malcolm is coming off like a jackass as he comes up with the script for a film about their lives, and John and Sid walk away and have some fun off screen, and he gives Steve, a dilemma, which is either Malcolm goes or John does, which is really too much as he chooses John to go as he's the biggest asshole in the band, which sort of makes sense. And Bases to come. He asks Sid to come with him, but unfortunately Sid does join him, and he's now the star, or he doesn't, I'll say, as he's now the star, and I just don't fucking care anymore. Sid is once again in the hospital as John comes to visit him one last time, and Steve visits Chrissy as he sees her playing the guitar. Meanwhile, Malcolm films the movie in which he wrote the script, and Steve gets heroin inside him in the bathroom, and Sid remakes My Way, which is a Frank Sinatra song, but it's his own lyrics as he makes it new, he plans on practicing it with Nancy, which is the greatest of ideas. Nancy commits suicide by cutting herself while in the bathroom in the hotel, and he gets arrested and gets sent to jail, while Chrissy gets the news about Sid killing himself. And I personally wasn't going with this anymore. Malcolm makes a shirt about Sid being alive, but writes, "We're dead, and up yours." And Steve realizes John was right about Malcolm. As he confesses it wasn't for Malcolm, Steve would be dead. Vivian admits Malcolm is like a little boy who can't take matters into his own hands. And Steve leaves Malcolm while we get old footage of the albums from the Sex Pistols getting burned half to hell, which is accurate, sure. John visits Steve after a show as Steve admits John was right about Malcolm, as he shouldn't have picked him over John, as this is their last moment together in life. And the show, as they talk before they depart ways and they say their goodbyes, and we end it with the Sex Pistols performing on Christmas Day in 1977 with kids and firemen. And I guess it was a fine way to end the show, but I still hate it for how overly sentimental it is. Now it's time for the rating. Let's get to it. I'll give this show a 1.4 out of 10. This is much worse than another film Danny Boyle did called The Beach, as the performances here are terrible despite the acting was fine, as this feels more forgettable than The Beach in my opinion. I hate the characters as they feel like assholes, and the shots are not the greatest despite its typical Danny Boyle style, but the show felt bloated and overly sentimental to the point I can't support the Sex Pistols as a band. While this felt like the greatest hits, this show makes me hate the Sex Pistols, as they say fuck off quite often, as it bugged the living shit out of me. And this is a very hard show to watch, as at the end of the day, it's absolutely horrible, and if it wasn't for Danny Boyle directing this, I would have just given up on the show from episode 1. And I tortured myself with this bullshit twice. And I'd like to thank you guys for returning to Danny Boyle, and until he makes another movie, please, Danny, whatever you do, do not make another show like this.